South Korea's economic growth rate to stay at 1.5% in 2023, mainly due to sluggish exports and faltering domestic demand caused by high interest rates. North Korea-backed hackers stole $1.7 billion worth of crypto last year to fund the regime's nuclear program. That's nearly quadruple the previous record theft the year before. The European Union says it's providing more assistance for Ukraine, while a 10th round of sanctions is on the way for Russia. 2022 was a lucrative year for crypto hackers, and the most prolific among them were reportedly hackers backed by North Korea. One blockchain analysis firm estimates that they stole roughly $1.7 billion. Our Han Sung-woo starts us off this morning.
In a report released earlier this week, U.S.-based blockchain analysis firm Chainalysis said that North Korea-backed hackers stole roughly $1.7 billion in cryptocurrency heists last year. That's about 44% of the total $3.8 billion stolen in crypto hacks in 2022, which the firm called the biggest year ever for hackers. This comes despite the market floundering last year, with various crypto trading companies collapsing and investors suffering huge losses. Typically, North Korea-backed hackers, such as those from the cybercriminal syndicate Lazarus Group, launder crypto through mixers, which mix cryptocurrencies from various users to hide the origins of the funds. Pyongyang has officially denied any allegations of crypto theft. But according to an expert panel monitoring United Nations sanctions, the regime has relied more and more on hacking to fund its weapons programs, as publicly declared trade declined under sanctions and COVID-induced lockdowns. That means crypto hacking could currently make up quite a large chunk of North Korea's economy. Chainalysis predicts, however, that the heists will get harder and less fruitful with each passing year, mentioning that American law enforcement, for the first time last year, had seized $30 million in funds stolen by North Korea-backed hackers. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
The UN remains committed to engaging with North Korea despite the regime's latest military threats. According to a UN spokesperson during a briefing on Thursday, that the organization will continue pursuing dialogue, which is believed is the only way for lasting peace and complete verifiable denuclearization on the Korean peninsula. This was a response to a question about the North's nuke for nuke comment, a day after Seoul-Washington combined air drills and a U.S. pledge to deploy more strategic assets in the region. White House officials also said Thursday that the U.S. is ready to talk and that the air drill is a part of regular exercises that should not be seen as trying to provoke Pyongyang. The EU has promised more assistance for Ukraine while preparing for a 10th round of sanctions on Russia. Our Lee Seung-ja has more.
With the Russian invasion of Ukraine nearing its one-year anniversary, the EU is continuing its military support for Ukraine. After holding talks with Ukraine, the EU Council announced Thursday that it plans to provide additional military aid to Ukraine to the tune of 500 million euros or $545.5 million through the European Peace Fund. EU member states also announced that they will contribute an additional $49.1 million to train Ukrainian soldiers. The decision was made to provide technical education and special training to accelerate the deployment of the German-made Leopard 2 tanks. In addition, the EU has also promised over $27 million to help clear landmines threatening the Ukrainian people. Meanwhile, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, during her fourth trip to Ukraine since the outbreak of the war, announced further sanctions against Russia over its aggression. She said that the 10th package of sanctions issued by the European bloc will be implemented on February 24th, exactly 1 year on from the outbreak of the Ukraine war. She added that in addition to the sanctions, Russia needs to be held accountable for its war crimes against Ukraine, with a dedicated center set to be established in The Hague to do just that.
Russia must be held accountable in courts for its odious crimes. Prosecutors from Ukraine and the European Union are already working together. We are collecting evidence. And as a first step, I'm pleased to announce that an international center for the prosecution of the crime of aggression in Ukraine will be set up in The Hague.
Von der Leyen is set to hold talks with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and EU Council President Charles Michel on Friday, where the three sides will announce additional support measures and cooperation plans, including tariff-free benefits for Ukrainian exports and cooperation in the renewable energy sector. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
We're almost a week into life without a mandatory indoor mask mandate for most sittings here in South Korea. It surely is a huge step out of the prolonged pandemic life, but that doesn't mean we're done with COVID. For today's On Point, we talk about the last remaining worries and challenges to overcome with Dr. David Kwok from Soonchunhyang University. Welcome back to the program, Doctor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Local health authorities have hinted that complete freedom from masks could happen this May. And also, they're forecasting the possibility of a complete return to pre-pandemic normality by this fall. Doctor, why May and why this fall?
So originally, when they set out their plans to lift the mandates for the mask, especially inside the indoors buildings, was that two out of the four categories are met, and they were namely covering the death rate from the COVID-19 itself, the transmission rates, the vaccine rates, and etc. And because two categories out of the four were met, they were able to go ahead and execute the two-step plan where they lift the mandates for masks in a step-by-step manner. So first step has been met, so we are now no longer mandated to wear the mask, but instead we're still recommended to wear the mask, especially in accordance with the common sense. If we're having any sorts of transmissive infectious diseases, we're strongly recommended to wear the mask. Now, further continuing with the original schedule, if the second part of the plan was to be met, it means that in nationwide response system has to be stepped down from it currently being on red to possibly orange, or to even further lower, yellow. The blue is the lowest out of the four. So we are not at that state yet, and we're hoping that it'll be in that level of the infectious disease coming in May. But also financially, we have currently allocated a separate amount of money to be solely designated for response to the COVID-19 pandemic situation. And I believe Chairman Chung is foreseeing that that would be reallocated back to its normal state of distribution as we had prior to the pandemic, probably hoping this coming fall. It wouldn't, I don't think, would necessarily mean that we're the whole the reality of this physicality or the situation will suddenly return to normalcy in the fall of time, but it is a stepwise plan that they're trying to execute. And those steps could only be taken once certain categories that they set out to be the conditions of would be met. So we have to still see whether or not they would actually happen in May of time and also fall of time.
Right. It sounds like we have one more reason to look forward to warmer weather. Now, students and children can now enjoy classes without masks. But what's concerning is that many children in South Korea have yet to be vaccinated. I'm sure you're pretty aware of that, but no masks and a low vaccination rate. How can we wisely manage this situation?
I think it's primarily through education. So not only for boosting up the vaccination rate among children, but more importantly, teaching our young children and ourselves also that it is common sense to wear the mask and keeping the good hygienic measures, especially when you're having common cold symptoms, when you're having transmissive infectious disease symptoms. I would not now at this point say that it is absolutely mandatory that all children should be vaccinated. But I would further iterate that it is, I think, important at this time that we still try to be careful in every regards to taking care of transmissive diseases. We have seen in the past year, 2 years or so through the pandemic that by wearing the mask, by keeping a certain level of distances and by washing our hands very thoroughly, we were able to bring down the levels of transmission of other commonly transmitted infectious disease as well. So going forward, excuse me, going forward, not only for just prevention of COVID-19, I think in order to prevent all kinds of transmissive diseases, as long as we can educate our young children that keeping the good hygienic measures is also what protects them, will be a wise management measure that we can take at this moment.
Sure, keeping hygiene is basic, right? Now, health authorities are also cutting the number of hospital beds for COVID-19 patients. We are much freer now that all those strict rules are removed, but we have one last remaining measure, 7-day quarantine for people who test positive. Now, when will that be lifted? Can we say we're done with COVID when that's gone?
Well, it's very tough for me to personally anticipate when that'll actually happen. It would not necessarily mean that it's the end of the pandemic era. However, it would only mean that things have eased greatly, and we can start consider COVID-19 as another commonly spread air droplet diseases. COVID-19 is quite similar to how we are handling with influenza. Every year or so, influenza and its effect globally is quite different. Some of the years we have it much easy, so the infection rate, the fatality rate is much lower than the other years. However, in rare occasions, it still comes back up and it still kills a lot more people than the other years. It still affects more vulnerable people much more greatly than the other years. I believe facing towards the end of the pandemic era, I think if at all, COVID-19 could become a transmissive disease quite similar to that of influenza, where we see yearly difference or even bi-yearly differences of its fashion in its effect, in its effects in healthcare. So when we say that the quarantine period could be lifted, it only means that we're at a state where we're able to handle COVID-19 with much easier measures, but not so much so that it's completely eradicated and we don't have to worry about it any longer. So I dearly look forward to seeing the lifting of quarantine measures as well, but it's only a measure that we either decide to take on or to discard it for the time being.
Surely. All right. Thank you always for your insights. Have a great day, Dr. Kwok.
Thank you.
South Korea's economic growth rate is projected to stay at 1.5% in 2023 due to a combination of contraction in domestic demand caused by high interest rates and also sluggish exports due to the global economic slowdown. That's according to the Korea Economic Research Institute on Friday, who lowered the outlook by 0.4% in its economic trends and prospects report. The figure is also 0.2% lower than the IMF's forecast of 1.7%. The institute also said that with domestic growth and momentum to overcome the global economic slowdown, the country could enter a full-fledged recession this year. Seoul's finance chief says the Fed's latest rate hike decision will serve to calm global market jitters. He nonetheless underscored the presence of variables. Our finance correspondent Lee Dae-hyun explains.
South Korea sees the U.S. Fed's overnight rate hike decision as easing uncertainty in the global financial market. The sentiment was expressed in a meeting held by Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho Thursday, hours after the Federal Reserve raised its benchmark rate by 25 basis points. In the meeting, the minister said the domestic market, too, is showing less volatility thanks to efforts made by the government over the past month.
The government's efforts to stabilize the market are now showing results. In January, the country saw strong growth in the stock market compared to other major countries. The dollar weakened against the won and government bond rates are significantly dropping.
However, he stressed that the government will continue to closely monitor the market as exports remain sluggish and high consumer prices are expected to stay for a while, causing more practical difficulties. Chu said the ministry is looking to find the right mix of monetary and fiscal policy as well as the right time to implement it. It aims to expand bonds for companies with low credit scores to further stabilize the market and alleviate capital shortages for small businesses. And to ease the financial burden, 10 trillion won or $8.2 billion will be invested to provide low interest rate loans for small business owners. Efforts to ease real estate loan restrictions were also pledged during the meeting. Meanwhile, the Bank of Korea earlier on Thursday also discussed how the Fed's decision will affect the domestic market. The BOK Senior Deputy Governor Lee Seung-hun said that due to a gap in how the Fed and the markets are viewing inflation and corrective measures, global financial volatility still remains. With this in mind, he pledged to monitor exchange rates and capital flow and implement measures to stabilize the market. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
South Korea's inflation accelerated in January, seeing the biggest rise in 3 months. Now, higher utility bills were the main driver. Our Lee Soo-jin reports.
South Korea's consumer prices last month saw their biggest on-year jump since October. Statistics Korea said on Thursday its consumer price index was at 110.11 in January, up 5.2% on year. That's up 0.2 percentage points from December's rate of 5%. This is also the 9th consecutive month that the figure has stayed above 5%. The statistics agency attributed the jump to the spike in utility fees.
Electricity bills in January rose 9.2% compared to the previous month. Most of the month's rise in consumer prices is due to electricity bills.
Last month, utility bills such as electricity, gas, and water climbed more than 28% on year, the highest rate on record, amid the prolonged war in Ukraine. Consumers saw their electricity bills increase several times last year, putting pressure on some of the most vulnerable.
I'm going to try to reduce my heating bills, but I think decreasing other areas of my spending is the only choice I have.
Consumers are also feeling the brunt of rising costs when they go grocery shopping. Prices of vegetables rose 5.5% on year, and fishery products 7.8%.
I can feel it. When I go shopping, I tend to compare prices and I usually choose products that are cheaper.
According to one expert, however, there is still hope for consumers this year.
While the consumer price index rose slightly for January, I believe that is temporary due to the rise in price of utilities and rise in price of foodstuff, partially because of the Lunar New Year and partially because of the cold weather.
The expert also added that while inflation will remain high for the rest of the year, it will soon be in a downward trend. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
For a look at the news from around the world, we now turn to our Matthew Ashley joining us here in the studio. Good morning, Matthew.
Good morning, Dami.
We thought the cold we had here in South Korea recently was unbearable, but that's nothing compared to the northeast of the U.S. Apparently, the region is bracing for what could be the coldest weather in a generation.
Well, that is right, Dami. Local weather services are forecasting wind chill so cold it could cause frostbite in less than 10 minutes. Now, they have warned residents from Pennsylvania to Maine to stay indoors and have labeled the weather a once-in-a-generation cold. Now, this as predictions show that wind chill temperatures from Friday to Saturday local time could potentially drop as low as minus 46 degrees Celsius. Now, the warning comes after an ice storm on Thursday left around 500,000 people without power across the southern states of Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Mississippi. Cold conditions there over the past several days have killed at least 8 people and led to thousands of flight cancellations. Turning over to Europe now, where 2 lawmakers in the EU Parliament had their immunity removed on Thursday local time amid an ongoing corruption probe. Now, Italian Andrea Cozzolino and Belgian Mark Tarabella can now be questioned by prosecutors over allegations of taking bribes from Qatar and Morocco in a bid to influence EU Parliament. The scandal erupted in December and saw 4 people charged on the same allegations. Among those arrested was one of the European Parliament's vice presidents, Eva Kaili. So far, over $1.6 million in cash has been recovered over a series of raids in Belgium and Italy. The so-called Qatargate scandal has rocked the EU. Qatar and Morocco have denied any wrongdoing. Now, Australia's $5 banknote is set to get a makeover. The current design features the late Queen Elizabeth II, but Australia's central bank said on Thursday local time that rather than replace her with King Charles III, it would use a design that honours the culture and history of Indigenous Australians. The new design will take a few years to implement. In the meantime, the current design will still be printed and will remain legal tender even after the new banknote is released. It is the only note that featured the late Queen, and images of the monarchy will still remain on coins. Now, the move comes amid growing questions over whether the former British colony should remain a constitutional monarchy. And finally, French national team defender Raphaël Varane has announced his retirement from international football. The Manchester United player said on Thursday that his decision comes after thinking on it for a few months. He will instead focus on his club career. Since making his debut 10 years ago, the 29-year-old player has appeared 93 times for the national side, scoring 5 goals. He was part of the French squad that won the 2018 World Cup in Russia. Varane's exit comes less than a month after France's captain and goalkeeper Hugo Lloris announced his international retirement.
Good morning. Temperatures remain chilly, starting off below freezing this morning across Korea with cold wave alerts in place, mainly in Gyeonggi-do, Gangwon-do, and Gyeongsang-pukdo provinces. Then a seasonal afternoon is in the forecast for most regions. Seoul seeing a high of 3 degrees, Daegu at 7. Then cloudy skies will give way to sunshine as the morning goes on. But dry air along the east coast gets worse, with more regions now under dry weather alerts. So if you're planning on going hiking or camping in eastern regions this weekend, please be extra careful with anything that could start a fire. But the weather should be nice though from tomorrow. We'll see things begin to warm up from tomorrow afternoon, which is Ikchun, the start of spring on the traditional calendar. So we can say the coldest part of winter has passed. Also, Sunday is Taeborum, when we can see the first full moon of the new year on the lunar calendar. Skies will remain clear on Sunday, so we won't have much of a problem checking it out. With that in mind, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. Do stay with us for more updates throughout the day. Happy Friday!